Where in heaven's name am I in this mess of notes and jottings and records and so forth? Oh, I remember. One of the guys who remembers George Sontag very well and remembers him as everybody remembers him, the fun side. George had terrible physical problems practically all of his adult life. But it was always hidden because there was always a smile and that infectious chuckle of his and a good wisecrack or a well-placed joke. One of the guys who remembers him well is a former announcer of ours, now an account executive in our television department, Ran Jansen.
Well, remembering George as he is, to me, is remembering humor. A light-hearted man seeming, and yet very deep inside. But George's laugh was infectious, and he used it liberally, sprinkled it on about everybody he knew, and made light of what ordinarily would be heavy work. I recall that laugh when we would be on stage and entertainers, name entertainers, who would come visiting and be doing a program or something of that nature, would soon really be playing to George and entertaining him, because he would react with this tremendous humor of his, this laugh, which would be infectious, and it wasn't long until the entire audience would be laughing with him. And name entertainers from all over the country coming to town, it would be funny to slowly watch them turn a little bit more and more toward that piano player, laughing from the bottom of his shoes. I remember his love for golf and getting into the outdoors. And I remember some of the silly things. I recall a program here we had in the morning with a piano on one wall of the studio and a Celeste on the other wall. And for 15 minutes, George played first one instrument, one or two selections, then he'd move over to the other one and play one or two selections. And in between, on radio, to cover the silence, the announcer would very quietly introduce George's next song and the instrument on which he was going to play it, and sometimes something about the composer. But mornings, when this program was on, wasn't George's best time. Being a nightclub entertainer, basically, throughout his history, he was a night people. And anything earlier than noon was very early in the morning. And I recall one morning his sitting at the Celeste, finishing a selection and off in a dream world, and the announcer introduced his next selection at the piano, and there was dead silence, and George suddenly realizing he was at the wrong instrument, and he got up and made a run for the piano, fell flat on his face in the middle of the studio, and that raucous laugh of his, just so typically George Sontag. And the other thing I remember about George is that he was one of the great arrangers, pop arrangers of our time. And I think too many people don't realize what a fantastic talent he had. He made everybody sound better than they really were. George had a knack of taking a mediocre talent, playing an accompaniment, and something about the whole thing just made that entertainer sound a little bit better. It was a fantastic talent. I remember George mostly for a man who thought a lot and hid his feelings well, but mostly radiated music and sunshine in the 20 years of my life. I can't remember him when he wasn't grinning, chuckling, saying something nice about somebody. And I don't think I ever recall seeing him lose his temper or being very angry at anybody. This was quite a fantastic human being. And I'm sure With his love of all facets of the music business and his complete understanding, whether it be rock, Dixie, jazz, classic, he enjoyed it all, admired the musicians, and loved every minute of it. When I think of George Sontag now, the only thing that really comes to my mind is when the Saints go marching in.
And somewhere they may be playing that. I saw George get mad once. Only once in the 23 years I knew the man. It was the early days of television. We didn't have any network. We're doing programs coming out our ears in 2 studios. And George was doing Soiree with Sontag. And he always came in at about 8:30 to rehearse a program that then went on at 9:30. It was a half-hour show. And it was never a full rehearsal. You couldn't get George to rehearse if you tied him down with a team of horses. And if he rehearsed, he wouldn't do it right, or the same way the second time. He'd do it right. It was always right, but it was always different. So he'd just kind of run through some of the things he was going to say and the tunes in order. And one day we changed the time of the show from 9:30 to 8:30. And at 8:29, George came in, and the guy who was the prop man was later to become the station manager, Ray Guth. And I'm standing there just kind of idly watching. I don't have anything to do till the 10 o'clock news. And all of a sudden, Guth's face went absolutely white. He suddenly realized that nobody had told George we'd moved the time of the show. And George was given occasionally to a little profanity, in fun. He never, that I ever know of it, used it with purpose. And all of a sudden, everybody is horrified. George thinks it's a rehearsal. We're live, we're on the air. There was no tape then. George got through, he took off his coat, he lit a cigarette, balanced it on the edge of the piano, loosened his tie, kicked his shoes off, and went through a rehearsal. Except it wasn't a rehearsal, it was live on the air. And everybody is sweating blood, you know, that he's going to say something. He didn't. It was the wildest half hour in the early days of television. George would get halfway through a tune and allow us how he didn't really like that one very much. Maybe he'd play another one on the show, so we'd start into that one. And the audience loved it. We got all kinds of mail on it. When it was all over, everybody got the color back in their face and breathed a little easier, except George, who for 20 full minutes did not believe that that had been on the air. And when he finally convinced himself that it had been on the air, he went off like a V-2 rocket. And it lasted probably 5 seconds. And he was calmed down and it was all over. But he was concerned because it hadn't been his best appearance. So that's something George always kind of worried about. But it's the only time I ever saw that man get angry. Only once.